Welcome to our benefits compliance briefing. My name is Brian Feeley. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing, and he is Dan Kuperstein, our Senior Vice President of Compliance, our very own ERISA and Employee Benefits Legal Guru. I think that's the official title. So how you doing, Dan?
Really great. Can't wait to talk about Cobra today.
Oh, me too. In fact, it's my favorite subject, especially after season 3. Johnny Lawrence and Danny LaRusso, I can't wait to see what they have in store for us for the next season. It's going to be great.
Wait, Johnny Lawrence? Oh, I think you're talking about something completely different. I think you're talking about Cobra Kai, like the TV show.
Oh.
I think that's something. Yeah, we're not going to talk about
the other Cobra. Yeah.
We're not
well, all kidding aside, I can't wait to see that. And you haven't seen it? Well, shout out to Cobra Kai. All right. So I won't say anything. I'm already getting messages about don't give anything away on Cobra Kai. That's awesome. Yeah.
For me too, don't give anything away. I haven't seen it yet.
So just as exciting as Cobra Kai is this live briefing on Cobra. So Dan, a lot to cover on this, a lot of confusion. Get us started. Tell us all about it.
Sure. So today's episode is on the recent Cobra premium subsidies offered as part of the recently enacted American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or ARPA for short. And that's commonly known as President Biden's $1.9 trillion relief package. And we're going to be discussing how this ARPA Cobra subsidy relief is actually part of a bigger story of confusing COVID-19 Cobra relief. And we'll call that the continuing COVID-19 Cobra conundrum. And among other topics we'll be talking about today, we'll address how the new ARPA Cobra subsidies, that's a lot to say, are different from the other COVID-19 Cobra relief, which healthcare plans the ARPA subsidies apply to, how long the subsidies last, and what an involuntary termination of employment is, and how that's different from termination on the basis of gross misconduct.
Well, first of all, I'm already getting acronym shivers here. ARPA sounds like something from a Star Wars movie. Let's level set. What is ARPA?
Yeah, that's a great idea, Brian. So sure, even though the ARPA, is not actually technically a character in Star Wars, it is somewhat Star Wars like. Actually, I would probably say Return of the Jedi like, and that's because we've actually seen similar legislation before. ARPA is in some ways the return of or reincarnation of an earlier law from the Great Recession called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, or ARA for short. So not ARPA, but ARA. And that law provided a 65% Cobra premium subsidy. And it was just really unimaginable at the time. And looking back, 12 years ago, the lawyers, my firm, we were just unsure of how this thing could possibly get administered. But look, we did it. We advised our clients, we got through it. And we really just didn't think it would ever come back. And then, to provide a little more of the important backstory here, let's now fast forward to right after the COVID-19 pandemic began to hit the U.S. hard back in April of 2020. At that time, the DOL and IRS issued joint guidance providing deadline extensions, and they were actually, technically these extensions had the effect of pausing or tolling certain benefit plan compliance deadlines for plan participants during a time period that was the president declared COVID-19 national emergency period. These pause periods would pause, among other things, employees' deadlines for electing Cobra coverage, deadline which is normally 60 days. And so these rules caused a lot of confusion about Cobra rights. And at the end of February of this year, so in 2021 in February, some of that confusion was clarified when the DOL issued new FAQ guidance on these rules, clarifying that those deadline extensions or pause periods can actually extend for up to a whole year, at least for so long as the national emergency period continues. And since this pause period is referred to in these rules as the outbreak period, those rules became known as the outbreak period rules.
So many rules. All right, it is definitely confusing. So we had something that happened way in the past, in a time long ago, whatever. We have now ARPA, and you just explain some of that. What's next?
Exactly. So now let's fast forward a little bit more to March of this year. So we're now in March of 2021. The ARPA is signed into law. Remember President Biden's big COVID relief, signed into law, and in that it provides for these extremely generous Cobra subsidies that cause a lot of confusion because, nothing in that ARPA statute as it was written really explained whether employees would have that whole 1-year pause period from the outbreak period rules to extend their normal 60-day election for electing Cobra when it came to electing their generous ARPA Cobra subsidies. And also a big thing there was that there were key definitions in the ARPA that really remained undefined. There was really kind of no answer on things. And the ARPA did not rely on that earlier 2009 definitions in the 2009 era subsidy relief law that we just talked about, which made decision-making on ARPA Cobra subsidies extremely difficult. And then just when we thought we could be scratching our heads anymore trying to figure this whole thing out, on April 7th of this year, the DOL, really just last week, right, April 7th, the DOL issued FAQ guidance and model notices on the subject of the ARPA Cobra subsidies. Unfortunately, those rules clarified that those outbreak period rules do not extend the 60-day window for electing Cobra for purposes of obtaining these Cobra subsidies under the ARPA, but they didn't clarify everything. They didn't answer all of our questions. And so we'll talk more about that new guidance and discuss how these new rules work as we go here.
So yeah, okay, yeah, we have to clarify some of that. Let's get right to how the subsidies work. So, what healthcare plans do they apply to? How long? What's the percentage that they're paying? I mean, you can run through some of that detail for us on how it all works.
Yeah, so that's a lot of questions, Brian. But
sorry,
but look, that's why we're here, right? So that's fine. Let's start with the last thing you said because I think it's probably the easiest thing for me to remember.
Okay.
The newer ARPA subsidies, the new ones that we just got, right, are completely paid subsidies, 100% paid. It's a free lunch. Even the 2% administrative fee is covered by the government, as was recently clarified in that April 7th guidance. But also, it's important to understand that as annoying and just dreadful as the ARPA truly is to HR and benefits departments, it is important to remember that these are only employer-fronted premium payments. And so in virtually all cases, with only some relatively minor exceptions for certain small insured plans and multi-employer plans, virtually in all cases, the employer is going to be paying for that entire amount of the Cobra subsidy up front. And then the employer will submit for reimbursement for these amounts on its quarterly payroll taxes. And then these monies will come back in the form of refundable tax credits from the IRS. So at least with regard to the premium payment part, it's not entirely on the employer, although certainly if a lot of employees are taking advantage of the free Cobra, this can definitely have a negative impact on claims experience and have a particularly hard hit on employers sponsoring self-insured health plans. So anyway, let's get some of those other questions. I know you have a lot of them, so let me try to remember.
By the way, Dan, I'm glad this is being recorded.
Right? Yeah, I know.
I may have to play it back again.
Yeah, exactly. So when are these subsidies available, right?
Yeah. Let's
get some of the other questions, right? Subsidies are available for, actually, let's start with which plans, right? Which plans are subject to this? Which plans can you get the subsidies for? These are available for group health plans, right? So it's a very big category. They're subject to Cobra, including group health plans that are accepted benefits, such as dental and vision coverage, but with the big exception of health FSAs, which are not eligible for these subsidies. The subsidies are also available to what are called assistance eligible individuals, or AEIs, from April 1st of this year through September 30th of this year. And that's a period of time referred to as the ARPA subsidy period. Okay. And so these AEIs, right, the eligible individuals, right, the folks who are able to receive the subsidies, right, are those individuals that have lost employer-based coverage due to a reduction in work hours, whether that reduction in work hours was voluntary or involuntary, or they're losing employer-based coverage due to an involuntary termination of employment, with the exception of terminations that are on the basis of gross misconduct, which is a very hard standard to meet. And we'll talk a little more about that later. But here's the interesting twist, Ryan, okay? The class of the subsidy eligible individuals is not limited to those who are currently on Cobra, but also individuals who could be on Cobra for such a qualifying event had they elected Cobra when it was offered. So Those people are also eligible for the subsidies if their Cobra continuation coverage period did or could have continued into that ARPA subsidy period, right? That time period between April 1st through September 30th of this year. So in other words, right, those people, who could have been experiencing a period of Cobra continuation coverage that continued into that ARPA subsidy period of 4/1 through September 30, they're going to get a new second election opportunity or a second bite of the apple to elect that free Cobra coverage. And at some point prior to April 1, actually, they can do it retroactively, so they have a little more time than that. They have 60 days from the time that they get a notice from their employer, which has to be provided by May 31st. But long story short, right, if they enrolled, there's even more generous things here, right? So even if they decline the coverage, or if they enrolled in an ACA exchange plan instead, when they were first offered Cobra, they can still now get a second or additional opportunity, or that second bite of the apple, to elect the Cobra coverage for that subsidy period of April 1 through September 30. And to make this even more fun, while there are some different interpretations out there by some of the different Cobra administrators on how this is going to work exactly, the recent April 7th guidance made it clear that employers must also front the ARPA Cobra subsidy for individuals who are on continuation coverage through comparable state-based Cobra laws, or laws often referred to as mini Cobra laws. And as you and I know, some of those laws can provide continuation coverage periods that are longer than 18 months. Now, there is some disagreement about whether or not they are eligible for that second bite of the apple, that second election opportunity. But we do know that if you are on one of those state continuation coverage periods, and it does run into that subsidy period, the employer does have to front a Cobra ARPA subsidy.
So this is on the employer to go back and try and figure out who could have elected Cobra, right? Due to an involuntary termination, except for the fact that it may have been gross conduct or whatever. Like, so there's all these different parameters. How in the world are they going to be able to do that and figure out if they truly, are really available to get this continuation of coverage? I mean, that's a lot of going back and forth and trying to figure out what people had done, whether they already accepted, new benefits, the state exchange. How does this all work for the employer, who we have a lot of folks on the call wondering the same thing probably?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely crazy, right? I mean, so one of the first things you got to do, and I know we're just kind of talking about how crazy this is here, right? But you've got to look back and figure out, like I said, who was involuntarily terminated, or who had a reduction in force, regardless of whether that reduction in force was either voluntary or involuntary. And so that could be a lot of people, right? And you have to take into account people who are on Cobra continuation coverage that could extend into that subsidy period, who are on state-based mini Cobra laws, right? And so especially if you're in a very large employer, let's say you've got thousands of employees across the country, right? This is going to get extremely complicated and very quickly.
Who's doing all of this? I mean, literally, that's a lot of administration. So I'm assuming that there's an answer or an outlet for all of our clients and employers out there. Who's taking care of all of this?
Yeah, and so the hopefully you've got a great Cobra administrator, right, that your organization is working with, and that's taking all of these things into account, right, and going back the right amount of time, right. And this is why I went to law school, Brian, so I didn't have to do math. But if you do go back 18 months, that's a long time ago. That takes you back to October of 2019. I hope I got that right, but right, you go back to October 2019, right? That's pre-pandemic, at least in the U.S. I mean, maybe in China it was bad, but that's pre-pandemic. And so, the ARPA is definitely going to require some serious administration. So obviously, you're going to want to work with a great Cobra administrator, and obviously who's taking all of these things into account, who's properly counting back the appropriate amount of months. And of course, your corporate synergies account manager or compliance consultant can also help you through this process and provide you with a better understanding of these rules as questions come up along the way.
So what about, this Cobra deadline extension, these pause periods, the outbreak period? how does one decide, or if they just want regular Cobra continuation coverage for another period, but it's not the ARPA subsidy period? I mean, what's the direction or guidance on that?
Yes, so you could still have the benefit of the outbreak period rules for elections of Cobra that are not elections solely for the purpose of obtaining the ARPA Cobra subsidy. So going back to that ARPA guidance that we received on April 7th, that guidance clarified that we can now disregard the outbreak period rules when it comes to determining which individuals are eligible for that ARPA Cobra subsidy. And that was an important clarification, right? Because otherwise it would have been disastrous, right? Trying to go back a whole year to figure out, who can elect the subsidies. However, right, that being said, the guidance clarified that the election of, subsidized Cobra coverage does not cut off an individual's pre-existing Cobra election right if it was extended under those outbreak period rules. So in other words, the ARPA guidance treats the subsidy election separately from that earlier extension guidance, the outbreak rules guidance. But the bottom line here is that, right, you can't get that full 1 year duration under the outbreak period rules to elect your Cobra subsidy.
All right, understand. But let's say I'm on Cobra for the entire 18 months. I don't know. Say maybe this whole thing was a flop that we're doing right now for this live briefing, and I get fired and on an involuntary termination. All right, so we're going to use our own example here. Hopefully that's not the case, and we get to do another live briefing. So let's say I'm in that ARPA Cobra, right? The subsidy period between 4/1 and 9/1. Could anything happen that might cause me to lose eligibility for the subsidy during that time? Would there anything that could occur to disrupt that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. So AEIs, these assistance subsidy eligible individuals, they also lose eligibility for the ARPA subsidies if the normal duration of their Cobra continuation coverage period ends, or would have ended, right, before that September 30th, 2021 time period. That's the end of the ARPA subsidy period, or if they become eligible for any other group health plan, including Medicare.
How would they know that? Like, how would they know that I'm eligible? Or let's say that I did enroll in another plan beginning July or so, somewhere in between that period.
Yeah, so the employee is required. So let's say you did, became eligible for something in the middle of that ARPA subsidy period. The employee is required to give notice of that to the employer, or else face a very steep penalty. So it's on the employee.
So it's on the employee. What's involuntary termination? How do you, since a lot of it is riding on that, right? How is that defined?
Yeah, exactly. So this is one of the big things, right? How much can you mess up, right, Brian? Right. How much? Let's say it was something worse, right? Something worse than just messing up this.
I'm capable
today.
Okay. I'm very capable.
Right. So,
but for sake of argument,
when does this get to the level of gross misconduct? Right. When do we get to, something that's really, really bad, and it's unlikely. Let's just first of all say it's unlikely that the employee is going to come forward. But if they do become eligible for another plan or Medicare, there is a penalty, a $250 penalty. It's not easy. So it's not easy to figure out who those people are, obviously, and so it's on the employee. But so it may not actually really happen. But going to that next question, right? Where do you draw the line, right? What is involuntary termination, and where do you draw the line before it becomes something so egregious that it's gross misconduct? And now, since it's gross misconduct, you're no longer eligible for the ARPA subsidy. So this was one of the areas that seemed to be. This is probably our most common question that we've been getting, and it seemed to be really missing from the recent April 7th guidance. And just the big problem here is the guidance does not define the term involuntary termination, but does allow an individual to request treatment as an assistance eligible individual if he or she has not received a notice from his or her employer relating to the subsidies. So there actually is a model form for requesting such treatment. It's included in that recent April 7th guidance. And in the form, the individual would certify that he or she has experienced an involuntary termination, or reduction in hours and is not eligible for other coverage. Now, while that information seemed to be this big kind of missing piece of the answer to the question, right, it doesn't answer a whole question, right? And it's the question of like, well, what is an involuntary termination? And unfortunately, we still don't have a good working definition of involuntary termination. And I think there's still a good chance, even if it's not 100% certain, that we will get further guidance on that definition. And it was defined in the 2009 era subsidy relief law, right? That Great Recession relief law. So if the DOL or IRS issues guidance defining involuntary termination similar to its 2009 era guidance, then it's likely that the employer would not then be able to rely on this employee attestation in the model notice and would instead be required to independently make this involuntary termination itself based on the definition of involuntary in the guidance and all of the underlying facts and circumstances. So what do we do, right? I mean, what do we do in the interim, right? If we're trying to decide what to do, without a real definition, we don't have a working definition here. Well, our view is the best answer is to take into account really all of the underlying facts and circumstances surrounding the termination and document it in a writing and retain that writing and really just use common sense in past definitions of that term, including the past definition that was in the 2009 era law and other laws. And we do know from those that certainly things like, poor performance or just cause termination, right? Those things are not sufficient to, make the assumption that the person voluntarily quit from their job. And so in most cases, the termination likely will be considered to be involuntary, when you look at all of the underlying facts and circumstances. So that, of course, naturally brings us to the next part of, right, how bad can you mess up, Brian?
That's on me. Yeah. Let's talk about gross misconduct.
Yeah, you can mess up pretty bad, I know. So,
oh, really? Yeah.
So gross misconduct, right? That's an extremely high standard. And while it was never actually defined in the Cobra statute, basically the courts have defined it as extremely wanton, willful misconduct, essentially conduct that goes above and beyond what most people even think of as misconduct. And with some examples including selling drugs when you work at a courthouse, selling drugs when you work at a pharmacy, and not the way you're supposed to be selling drugs when you work at a pharmacy. Cases where there was clear evidence of theft and embezzlement. And so it's an extremely high standard to meet, and your employee really has to engage in some extremely egregious misconduct before you can feel confident that a judge will uphold the termination as truly being on the basis of gross misconduct.
Well, that's a handful of information, certainly. By the way, that guidance that's coming out, it seems like anytime any guidance comes out, there's never, it's never comprehensive. It doesn't matter whether we're talking Cobra or we're talking about any part of the ACA. It seems like every time we do these e-alerts, we have partial guidance, and it seems like this is no different. So no wonder you're getting a lot of questions. I'm curious, what specifically are the types of questions that you're getting right now? You mentioned a few, but just kind of get a sense of some of the other questions you're getting.
Yeah, exactly. Look, and this is why we always say, stay tuned and, wait for more to come, right? Because one of the big things I think, well, there's a lot of things missing still, and a lot of questions, but one of the big ones that is still out there is severance agreements, right? What do you do with severance agreements that are already subsidizing the Cobra for that time period that goes over that ARPA subsidy period? And can the employer take the tax refund for that? So we don't have any answer, unfortunately, to that question. And, it's quite a regular occurrence that employers pay for Cobra to be subsidized in severance agreements. And the ARPA statute itself didn't really provide much information. There are some legal commentators and, have interpreted the statute to say that, well, the statute indicates that if a Cobra subsidy is otherwise provided for, then the employer can't then claim the tax refund. So, if it's already provided in the severance agreement, you can't get the refund. But that's not 100% clear, at least not from my reading of it. And it would have been much more helpful if the April 7th guidance would have come out with a much more clear statement as to what you can and cannot do with severance agreements. And I think that at least on a going forward basis from here, right, employers are probably going to be reconsidering, paying for Cobra in their severance agreements that would have subsidized Cobra during that ARPA subsidy period. And so, well, that's probably the big one, right? That's kind of the big question mark out there. But that's just one among many, right? There's still some other ones. For example, how do multiple employer welfare arrangements, or MIWAs, which of course include things like association health plans, which all association health plans are also MIWAs, right? How do those things work? How does the ARPA subsidy work with those? How do the notices work for those? Questions about how the ARPA subsidies and their notices should apply to small, ancillary type of group health plans that are not linked to the major medical coverage and can be elected separately. So that's some of the questions we've been getting, but there's obviously a lot more, and we could probably talk all day about those things.
Well, we don't have all day, unfortunately. There was a lot of information. We're up on our time limit here, but I'm probably going to go back and listen to this at least 3 more times and try to avoid gross misconduct, if you ask me. But Dan, thanks as always. Dot, thank you as always for being able to provide at least some clarity amongst a very confusing topic. And given all of the information that we're talking about here, I'm sure that there's more to come. As we always say, stay tuned. And, is anything else that you would be able to leave folks with, Dan, that, might help them out?
Well, yeah, just check out our resources online. We have this great Compliance Resource Center page. You kind of have to scroll down a little bit, but you'll see all of our e-alerts on this topic and other topics that are important right now. And we also have our HAWC, HAWC HAWC social media page. So just stay tuned, and we'll be making sure that everyone is updated on everything that's going on right now.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And thanks everybody for joining.